Nathaniel Carter sat alone in his penthouse, a masterpiece of glass and steel overlooking the San Francisco skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a breathtaking view of the Golden Gate Bridge, its lights shimmering over the bay. Yet, despite the grandeur surrounding him, Nathaniel felt an unshakable emptiness. At 46, he had achieved everything most people could only dream of. His name was synonymous with power, innovation, and an empire built from nothing. The Carter Group had revolutionized artificial intelligence, making him one of the wealthiest men in the world. He had private jets, luxury cars, and access to the most exclusive circles of society. But none of it mattered when he returned home to an eerily silent penthouse. His personal life was a series of calculated decisions that had never yielded fulfillment. 2 failed marriages, each more disastrous than the last, had left him cynical about love. His ex-wives had entered his life like hurricanes, full of passion and promises, only to leave with hefty settlements and bitter words. He had learned his lesson. Emotions were liabilities, relationships were risks, and love was nothing more than a beautifully packaged illusion. Yet, one thing haunted him: a legacy. The Carter name would die with him unless he did something about it. His wealth, his empire, everything he had built. What was the point if there was no one to inherit it? He didn't want just anyone carrying his name. He wanted an heir, someone he could shape, someone who would carry on his empire long after he was gone. But the idea of another relationship, another marriage filled with manipulation and legal battles, was out of the question. That's when the thought took root in his mind. Why did he need a wife to have a child? What if he could have an heir without the entanglements of a relationship? The more he considered it, the more the idea made sense. He could ensure complete control over the process, choosing a woman who had no claim to his fortune beyond what was contractually agreed upon. A business arrangement. A transaction. No emotions. No complications. Nathaniel set his whiskey glass down on the marble counter and made a decision that would change his life forever. The rain drizzled over the streets of San Francisco as Nathaniel's sleek black Tesla Roadster glided through the city. He wasn't the kind of man who drove aimlessly, but tonight, he found himself doing exactly that. His mind was restless, consumed by his new plan. He had spoken to his legal team, who assured him that everything could be arranged discreetly. All he needed now was the right woman. But who? He had no interest in surrogacy through an agency, too impersonal. He didn't want to choose from a list of anonymous candidates like he was shopping for a product. He wanted someone real, someone he could observe before making his decision. As he pulled up to a red light near Union Square, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden tap on the car window. A woman, thin, frail, with tangled dark hair spilling over her shoulders. She was wrapped in a threadbare coat, her face smudged with dirt, yet her green eyes burned with something fierce, defiance, survival, something he couldn't quite place. "Sir, do you have anything to spare?" Her voice was hoarse, tired, but not broken. Nathaniel's first instinct was to ignore her. He wasn't in the habit of giving handouts, and he certainly didn't make a habit of interacting with strangers on the street. He turned his gaze back to the road, waiting for the light to change. But something about her made him pause. Perhaps it was those eyes, or the way she stood, proud despite her circumstances. She wasn't like the other homeless people he had encountered, those who had long since lost the will to fight. No, this woman still had something left in her. A ridiculous thought crossed his mind. Could she be the one? The honk of a car behind him jolted him back to reality. The light had turned green. Without a word, he pressed the accelerator and sped off, leaving her behind. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Minutes later, he found himself circling back toward Union Square. She was still there, now sitting on a park bench, hugging her coat tighter around her body. Rain dripped from her hair, and she shivered slightly but didn't beg anyone else for help. Nathaniel pulled up to the curb and lowered his window. "Get in," he said. She turned her head sharply, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? I have an offer for you." The suspicion in her gaze deepened. "I don't get in cars with strange men." "Smart," he said, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "But I'm not here for what you think." She hesitated. "Either get in or don't," he continued. "But I promise you, This will be the most important conversation of your life." A beat of silence passed between them. The rain intensified. Finally, with clear reluctance, she stood and approached the car. "Fine," she muttered, opening the door and sliding into the passenger seat. Nathaniel glanced at her, feeling something unexpected stir within him. He wasn't sure if it was intrigue or fate, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. Inside the sleek car, Camille sat pressed against the door, clutching the edges of her worn-out coat like a protective shield. The warmth from the heater seeped into her frozen fingers, yet it did nothing to melt the tension that gripped her chest. The man beside her, Nathaniel Carter, radiated an aura of power, control, and something else she couldn't quite place. He was assessing her, calculating her worth as if she were a business asset, not a person. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same cool detachment that marked everything about him, he said the words that would change her life forever. "I want you to have my child." Camille blinked. Then she laughed, a short, dry, disbelieving sound. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious." Nathaniel's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. "You won't have to do anything except carry the child. I'll take care of all expenses, ensure your well-being, and when it's over, you'll walk away with financial security." She gaped at him. "So you're looking for a walking incubator?" Nathaniel shrugged. "Call it what you want." Camille's jaw clenched. "Why me? In this city alone, there are thousands of women healthier, wealthier, and more qualified for something like this. Precisely because you have nothing." His words were cutting, brutal in their honesty. "You have no legal standing to fight for custody, no connections to drag this through court. You're the perfect candidate." She stared at him, torn between outrage and disbelief. "This is insane," she muttered, shaking her head. "I'm not some commodity you can buy." Nathaniel sighed, as if dealing with someone slow to grasp the obvious. "Think of it as a transaction. I need an heir. You need a way out of this life. We help each other." Camille's hands balled into fists. The rational part of her screamed at her to get out of the car, to walk away from this madness. But then he said something that made her hesitate. "Aren't you curious to know how much I'm offering?" Camille clenched her jaw. She didn't want to care. She didn't want to ask. But she did. "How much?" Nathaniel smirked. $3 million. Her breath hitched. Camille sat in a vast, high-ceilinged office, staring at the contract laid out before her on a glass-top desk. The office belonged to Nathaniel, a space that exuded wealth, precision, and power. There was nothing personal in it, nothing sentimental, just like him. $3 million. The number echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. It was enough to change everything. Enough to ensure she never had to sleep on a park bench again, never had to scavenge for food, never had to wonder if she would survive another winter. It was enough to go back to France, to start over. But at what cost? She glanced at the suited man sitting beside Nathaniel, his attorney, a middle-aged man with the expression of someone who had seen and signed off on countless deals, never once stopping to consider the human impact. "The terms are clear," the lawyer said, sliding the contract toward her. "You will conceive through in vitro fertilization, receive the best medical care, and reside in a safe, comfortable environment for the duration of the pregnancy. Upon the child's birth, you will be compensated as agreed and will have no legal claim to the baby." Camille's eyes skimmed the words on the page. They were airtight. There was no loophole, no way to back out once she signed. She inhaled deeply. "Can I have time to think?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I'm not forcing you, but I'm also not waiting forever. If you say no, I'll find someone else." The words hit like a slap. He made it sound so simple, as if she was replaceable, just another option on a list. The thought made her stomach churn. But did she really have a choice? She had hit rock bottom. Every day on the streets was a battle for survival. Wasn't this exactly what she had been praying for? A chance to escape? Her gaze drifted back to the contract. $3 million. A new life. A child she would never see again. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. The ink bled onto the page, forming letters that sealed her fate. There was no turning back now. Camille lay on the examination table, her body tense as the cold ultrasound gel touched her skin. The soft hum of medical equipment filled the air, and a monitor flickered to life, displaying the first glimpse of the life growing inside her. She turned her head slightly, stealing a glance at Nathaniel. He stood near the window, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on the screen. His expression remained unreadable. No excitement, no anticipation, just the same detached composure he had maintained since the beginning. "You're progressing well," the doctor said, smiling at Camille. "The embryo has implanted successfully. Everything looks healthy." Camille nodded, her mind struggling to process the reality of it all. A few weeks ago, she had been sleeping under a tattered blanket in a subway station. Now, she was in one of the most exclusive fertility clinics in the country, carrying the child of a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. Her new life was surreal. Nathaniel had arranged everything. A private apartment in an upscale neighborhood, regular medical checkups, and a bank account that had more money in it than she had ever seen. She no longer had to worry about food, shelter, or safety. And yet, she felt more trapped than ever. The child inside her wasn't just an obligation. It was growing, changing, becoming real. She could already feel the slightest shifts in her body, tiny signs of the life she was nurturing. This wasn't just a contract anymore. It was something deeper, something she hadn't expected. Later that evening, back in her apartment, Camille sat on the bed, absent-mindedly running her fingers over her stomach. She wasn't showing yet, but she knew the baby was there. She had thought she could do this without feeling anything. She had been wrong. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Nathaniel standing there, his usual crisp suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. "How are you feeling?" he asked. The question took her by surprise. He hadn't bothered asking before. "I'm fine," she said cautiously. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment before nodding. "If you need anything, let me know." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. Camille closed the door, her heart pounding. Why was he suddenly acting like he cared? Time passed, and Camille's pregnancy progressed. With each passing day, her body changed, her stomach grew, her cravings intensified, and her emotions became unpredictable. She told herself she was still just fulfilling her end of the bargain, that none of this mattered beyond the contract. But then something shifted. Nathaniel started visiting more often. It wasn't just about doctor's appointments or contract updates anymore. Sometimes, he would drop by her apartment unannounced, bringing things she hadn't asked for: fresh fruit, expensive prenatal vitamins, books about pregnancy. He never lingered, never said much, but the mere act of showing up unsettled her. One evening, after a long day of dealing with nausea, Camille struggled to get up from the couch. The weight of her growing belly made everything harder now. A strong arm suddenly wrapped around her, lifting her effortlessly. She gasped, finding herself in Nathaniel's arms. "You should be more careful," he murmured, setting her back down gently. She stared at him, her heart hammering. "I didn't ask for your help." "I know." His gaze flickered downward, briefly landing on her stomach. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes. Something softer, something human. She swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "Because you're carrying my child. That's all." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step back, as if catching himself before he crossed a line he hadn't planned to. "I'll have the driver bring you dinner," he said, his voice returning to its usual neutral tone. Camille watched him go, her emotions a tangled mess. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to care. And she wasn't supposed to care that he did. The walls around Nathaniel's penthouse were as pristine and cold as the man himself. Or at least, that's how Camille had always seen it. But lately, something had changed. She wasn't sure when it started. Maybe it was the way Nathaniel had carried her so effortlessly that night, or the way he kept showing up with things she needed before she even realized she needed them. He still tried to act detached, keeping his distance, but Camille could sense the shift in him. One afternoon, she found herself in the library of his penthouse. a book open in her lap. Nathaniel had insisted she stay there instead of her apartment as her pregnancy progressed, claiming it was for convenience. She knew better. It was his way of keeping an eye on her. "You're up late." His voice pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to find him standing by the door, dressed in his usual crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked different, less like the ruthless businessman she had met months ago, and more like a man who had something on his mind. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, absent-mindedly rubbing her stomach. "The baby keeps kicking." Nathaniel hesitated, then crossed the room. He sat down on the armchair across from her, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Does it hurt?" Camille smiled faintly. "No, it's just strange. Like there's a tiny person inside me trying to say something." She expected him to dismiss the sentiment, but instead, he leaned forward slightly. "Can I?" It took her a moment to realize what he was asking. She nodded, and he reached out, resting his hand gently on her stomach. The baby kicked again, and for the first time, she saw Nathaniel Carter, cold, logical, emotionally distant, look completely and utterly stunned. His fingers twitched slightly, and for a second, it seemed like he forgot himself. Camille watched him closely, searching his face. "What do you feel?" Nathaniel swallowed, his throat bobbing. He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he said, "Something real." A silence stretched between them, thick with meaning. Camille's heart pounded as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. The night the contractions started, Camille wasn't ready. She had convinced herself she had more time, that she could delay the inevitable. But life had other plans. Doubling over in pain, she gripped the edge of the bed, gasping. A wave of panic surged through her. She had been alone in the room, trying to sleep, when the first sharp cramp hit her. At first, she had ignored it, thinking it was just discomfort. But now, as another contraction racked her body, she knew. This was it. The baby was coming. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway within seconds, his usual calm shattering when he saw her. "Camille?" "It's happening," she managed to say, her breath coming in shallow pants. His face paled. For the first time since she had met him, he looked completely unprepared. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms and carried her to the waiting car outside. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and rushed breathing, Nathaniel's usually steady hands gripping hers tightly. "I'm here," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm not leaving." Tears stung her eyes. She hadn't expected him to stay. Hours passed in a haze of agony and exhaustion. She barely registered the nurses moving around her, the beeping machines, the doctor's voice instructing her to push. And then, a sharp cry pierced the air, followed by another, and another. Nathaniel, who had been clutching her hand the entire time, went completely still. Camille turned her head, her vision blurred with tears. The doctor looked at them both, his expression astonished. "Congratulations. You have triplets." Triplets. A strangled sound escaped Nathaniel's lips. His hand tightened around hers, and for the first time, Camille saw something break in his carefully constructed walls. He was no longer the man who had treated this as a contract. As he stared at the three tiny, squirming babies in the doctor's arms, he was something else entirely. He was a father. Nathaniel Carter had built an empire on control. He controlled his business, his reputation, his emotions. But as he stood in the dim hospital room, staring down at the three tiny newborns in Camille's arms, he realized there was no controlling what he felt in that moment. It was overwhelming. The babies were so small, so fragile, their little fingers curling and uncurling as they let out soft whimpers. Camille, exhausted but radiant, gazed down at them with pure, unfiltered love. Nathaniel had never seen anything like it. One of the nurses gently placed a bundled baby into his arms. He stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. The tiny creature squirmed, making a small sound, and instinctively, Nathaniel's arms tightened protectively around the child. His child. For months, he had told himself this was just a transaction, that he would ensure the babies, had everything they needed financially, but nothing more. Now, standing here, holding his newborn son, he knew he had been lying to himself. A rush of emotion, foreign and terrifying, swept over him. His grip on the child tightened slightly, as if afraid the moment would slip away. Camille watched him, her expression unreadable. "You're not the man I met months ago," she whispered. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "I don't know what kind of man I am anymore." She smiled softly. Maybe that's a good thing. He looked back down at the baby in his arms, and for the first time in years, he felt something crack inside him. The cold businessman he had been was gone. In his place stood a father. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Carter was afraid, because he had something to lose. Days passed in a blur of hospital checkups, sleepless nights, and endless bottles of formula. Nathaniel had never imagined himself in this world. Changing diapers at 3 a.m., pacing the room with a crying baby in his arms, watching Camille soothe their daughter with a gentle lullaby. He had spent his entire life believing love was a weakness. But here, in the quiet moments with his children, he realized it was the only thing that truly mattered. One evening, as the triplets finally settled into sleep, Nathaniel found Camille sitting by the window in their new home, a sprawling estate he had purchased to give the children the best life possible. She was staring at the moon, lost in thought. Without thinking, he walked over and sat beside her. "You haven't asked about the contract," he said quietly. Camille turned to him, her expression calm. "Because it doesn't matter anymore." His chest tightened. "Everything in my life has always been planned," he admitted. "Every decision calculated. But this them. None of this was supposed to happen like this." She studied him for a long moment. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she asked, "Do you regret it?" He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her skin. "No," he murmured. "Not for a second." A silence stretched between them, filled with all the unspoken words they weren't ready to say. Camille exhaled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then let's not think about contracts anymore." Nathaniel closed his eyes, breathing her in, feeling the warmth of her beside him. For the first time in his life, he let go of control. And for the first time, he was truly happy. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end of this story. Your time and attention mean the world to us. We hope you found the journey both impactful and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video with others who might appreciate it. Your support helps us continue creating content that resonates and inspires. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so feel free to leave us a message. Stay tuned for more stories, and thank you once again for being a part of our community. Until next time.